around the car to the driver's side and opened the door, and that's when he saw Michelle.
Does Mark have a suspect in this killing?
No, sir.
He had said that his friend might have been a policeman or a sheriff or something like that.
I didn't take but a split second. I said, that's not Mark. I said, that's Matt.
Mark have it, nor Matt have it. We're vampire or friend. Why was that not done?
So he's like, hey man, I saw this murder in the news. They don't know who did it. Let's tell them Josh did it.
I don't know. I don't know that they weren't.
It seemed like pretty much anything was for sale down there
I don't know.
at the right price.
He said, he said, Bill's been in there long enough. He's made enough money. He says, it's about time a younger man gets in there. He said, like you can get in there and make some good money.
Paychecks from bullshit.
They never investigated me. They merely put me on trial and told the jury they had.
Hi there, I'm Bob Miller, the host of the Lawless Files, and we're here for a bonus Q&A episode that we're going to do. We're here with Tyler Grafe.
Hello.
Hi, Tyler. He helps out, as we've mentioned before, with some of the production stuff behind the scenes, but also a set of ears for me, and has been helping me this whole time. So Tyler, thanks for joining us today. First, I wanted to kind of mention, did you see the KFES report recently that was done? What were your thoughts on that?
I did. I was impressed. They the whole way through, they kept the focus on the reason that this case is still so important. Namely, there are killers, or killers, who are still out there, still ostensibly a part of the community, and that can't stand. And it's heartening to see so much enthusiasm in kind of a public way, people demanding progress.
KFES was I interviewed with Crystal Britt for about 45 minutes or so. We put up the full interview on our website, so if you're watching this, listening to this, you can have access to the full interview on the website as well. But you can't really get a whole lot into a minute and a half segment, but we certainly appreciate Crystal Britt and Don Frazier, who is the cameraman behind the scenes. We appreciate them. This is the second time KFES has interviewed me about the case. And it's a huge boost to the public awareness of what's going on. So big shout out to KFES. We were also on KZIM with Von Riggin a while back. So appreciate that local media support. But yeah, the KFES thing was big. So in fact, it helps our traffic. We're up to according to Apple statistics, we're up to over 340,000 views so far. That's a big number. We've got 13, 14 episodes or partial episodes out on the main platform. So that's great. It's a big number, but we're continuing to grow. So don't want to stick on this topic for too long. Let's go ahead and jump into the questions. Tyler, what's the first one you got there?
Absolutely. And before we start the questions, these have come through to our discussion group, right? Maybe we could plug the...
Yeah, we said we put on the discussion group, hey, we're going to have Q&A. So some of these I've pulled from the comment section, but most of these have come from the because we linked to the tip form and asked people to put their questions through there. So that's where most of these are coming from.
Okay. Now, so the first question, has Kevin Williams' DNA ever been collected, submitted, or analyzed?
The answer to that is yes.
What happens now? What?
To my knowledge, that DNA evidence has not yielded any direct evidence to Michelle. So that's to my knowledge.
Okay. So the next one is about the crime scene. I'd like to know, quote, I'd like to know more about the pipe that was found in her car. Seems like it would be a crucial piece of evidence to reveal fingerprints, possible DNA, and which drug was being used. Makes no sense for her to have a pipe like that if her toxicology report was negative. Had to be someone else's pipe, and it seems like there would be prints on it, end quote.
That was the same reaction I had when I was reading through those depositions. So the item you're talking about that you're describing was kind of mentioned as a black or a brass tube. And the director of the crime lab, his name is Dr. Robert Briner. He testified in the deposition I was talking about that it contained traces of cocaine. And again, like the listener pointed out, Michelle's toxicology was clean, so she did not have drugs in her system, just traces of alcohol. So when I found that in the deposition, it really piqued my curiosity. I was like, well, that could have led down, some sort of motive trail. But they didn't want it tested further. Dr. Briner was like, I've got this. Do you want it tested further? We could do more tests. And not only did the prosecution say no, Josh's attorneys said no. Al Lowe's kind of made a joke on it. But I contacted Rick Walter, and he didn't remember that passage in the deposition, and that it contained traces of cocaine. But he did say that he was unaware that the tube existed. In other words, what he was saying was, I went through all of the physical evidence that remained at the sheriff's department. There was no tube there. So the next step I took was I went to the crime lab, to the new director, and she told me, like, all of that stuff the highway patrol stores for us, all of the the history or the evidence and the logs and all that. So I sent a records request to the Missouri Highway Patrol asking for the complete evidence logs, so when you have to sign in and sign out any evidence dealing with the Lawless case. And they declined my records request because they said it's an ongoing investigation. But to me, if that tube still exists, yeah, I'd want to look for fingerprints on it. I'd want to check it for DNA. I think that's a good point. I wish I knew more about it. I'd love to know more about it, but at this point, that's pretty much all I know.
And the next question, what will the next step be if it is known in the ending podcast who actually did it? And when will they be charged? How much evidence does there have to be for that to happen? Okay, so we're swinging for the fences.
Right. So, that's not a question the podcaster can answer. That's only a question that the prosecutor can answer. So we'll just have to wait and see on that. I am presenting a lot of evidence that's already out there, plus my own investigation of stuff. So it's it's the question everybody wants, right? I have that question, like, how much do you need? And so we're at the Lawless Files. We're asking that same question, and we're wondering just along with everybody else. So it's a good question. I wanted to leave it in there, but yeah, the answer is I don't know. That's up to the prosecutor.
So next question, does Rick Walter plan on running again? He would win, given that everyone knows now, thanks to the podcast.
So I don't know the answer to that. If he's planning on running again. It was a really bitter election last time, and he lost. And I'd have to push back a little bit, saying he would win, given what everybody knows now, thanks to the podcast. I don't know that that's a true statement. There's so much more national political factors that go into local politics these days. And I just, I'm trying to inform the public, but there's just a lot of people who don't want to be informed, and know what's going on and all of those things. So, like I just don't know. I mean, a lot of people, I mean, the podcast is the talk of Southeast Missouri. I can't go anywhere now without hearing about it. Do you have stories like that, Tyler? Like,
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's people in passing and saying, have you heard about this? Oh yeah. Oh, and you put it in your pocket.
Yeah.
Or you tell them about the website, like,
Yeah. I went to get my oil change the other day and somebody recognized me and 2 or 3 people came up to me asking about it. I went to my son's ball practice. One of the dads came over, like it's the talk of Scott County. It's talk of Southeast Missouri, but I'm just not sure if people will even remember it when it comes next election. People are thinking
Yeah.
about the national talking points more so than the local ones. And if, so I don't know.
Because they mentioned it in the KFVS, and it's been part of this case the whole time. It's kind of a two-way street, but it's been 30 years and people have been talking about it. Nobody's forgotten about it.
Right.
But it has just, if people can talk about it and it be a salient issue for 30 years and still we're struggling to get anything to happen on it, it's tough to say.
Yeah. All right. What's the next one?
The next one, I just listened to the Tom Beardsley interview and I have a few questions. Question number 1, I always assumed Michelle's car was on the viaduct, but from listening to the podcast, I am assuming it was on the ramp leading to the viaduct.
Yes, that's correct. It was on the ramp. She was behind the stop sign. The car was parked behind there. She was coming from Sykeston.
And I'm wondering if you could see cars up on the viaduct.
Yeah,
meaning where
yeah.
the car was parked.
Yeah, so I'm guessing she means could you see cars on the viaduct, the overpass from where she was at? One of the things I would say is that if they had their lights on, sure. I mean, I think you could see a car coming. But I think it was pretty dark out there. If a car was up there and lights were off, I'm not sure. I haven't gone out there to test that. Michelle was not pulled all the way up to the stop sign. Walter, when he came, he parked his entire vehicle without the rear end, hanging out into the Highway 77 there. So I'm not exactly sure what Michelle could have seen on the overpass. I just don't know on that. But certainly if they had their lights on, she could see, I would think. And if you go there, the sight lines, once you pull up to the stop sign, the sight lines are pretty clear. I'm just not sure if she could have seen where she was at or not. Just kind of a related point, there was a witness who stated that she saw a white Ford Escort on the overpass that night in the area of 12:30 to 12:45, give or take. So somebody saw a car on the overpass that night. I just thought I'd throw that in there.
Yeah. And so the same question, ask her the second question, the timeline of who arrived at the scene first, their rank, including West Jury's rank, and anyone at the jail the night of the murder. Okay. Recap.
Yeah. So, we replayed the Beardsley interview. He talked a lot about, what was going on at the scene. So there's a lot of questions and then there's a lot of chatter about this on the discussion group. As far as like, rank, they didn't really have rank. It was just everybody was a deputy. You might have a detective title, I guess, maybe, but the only one who had rank that I'm aware of was chief deputy, and that's Tom Beardsley. Jury was deputized. He was a deputy, but he was the jailer dispatcher. So even the jailers and dispatchers oftentimes had the same, like they were deputized. So Jury was an official deputy, and he was a paid deputy with more experience than Rick Walter was. So yeah, I think he had some authority there. Newman was at the jail that night. He also helped dispatch. In fact, Newman was the one who made the call to Beardsley. And the first responders arrived like about 3 or so minutes after they were called. So they arrived at the scene. The first ones arrived around 1:32, and then the NBC ambulance personnel arrived around 1:35.
Okay. And along the same lines, when did the highway patrol arrive, and what was each person at the scene's responsibility?
Okay, so yeah, so I'm referring to my notes here that I've taken because there are some minor like inconsistencies on this, but I don't necessarily think that. I just think they're telling it from their own perspective. But Officer Kinley was a patrolman, and he was the first from the highway patrol there. He was there around 1:35. So he arrived at the same time or just before Beardsley. That's what I don't know, but it was like one right after another. So in Beardsley's report, again, this is going back to the records that I have here. There are reports, investigative reports that are made by these officers at the time. So in Beardsley report, he said Kinley arrived shortly after he arrived. Kinley's report said he ran the plates and discovered that the car belonged to Esther Lawless, who is Michelle's mother. So when Kinley arrived, Walter and Moore were already on the scene, along with 2 other volunteer rescue persons and 2 other EMTs. The EMTs were Ivan Legrand and Gene Hillman, and I have reports from them. And once they determined there was no pulse or signs of life, Kinsley asked the EMTs to remove their equipment, and Kinsley secured the scene. That's according to Kinsley's report. So at that point, Kinsley placed a white paper sheet from his car over Michelle's body. And then Beardsley's report says Kinsley asked if he wanted assistance, and Beardsley accepted that offer. So again, in the Beardsley interview, he's like, we discovered that there was blood going down the hill. There was, some sort of disturbance that happened, and he knew they had 2 separate crime scenes. And so he's like, that was more than we could handle. So this is Beardsley accepting Kinsley's request, and then Kinsley then relayed that on to the highway patrol. Another deputy, Deputy Shoemaker, arrived and was assigned to canvass the area for hitchhikers and abandoned vehicles. And so around 2:00 or so, Sheriff Farrell arrived and took over command of the investigation. But from about 1:40 to 2 a.m. or so, Beardsley was in control of the scene and was being assisted by the highway patrol. When Farrell got there, Deputies Shivitz and Chambers were called to the scene, and then Shivitz then met Farrell at the Lawless residence. So that's kind of the order of things there. I hope that answers the questions. There's more to it than that, but that's the nuts and bolts. Ultimately, later on, the patrolmen who worked the scene were Sergeant James Keithley, Sergeant Dennis Overby, and Trooper Steve Hensley. So that's in addition to Kinsley, who was Kinsley was actually off duty that night, I think. Heard the scanner traffic and went to the scene. So ultimately, there were at least 4 highway patrolmen there that night.
Okay. And so staying with the night of the crime, did West Drury have authority to keep Abbott?
Yes, he's a deputy, and you've got a witness that's coming into the jail. In fact, the witness is coming to report the crime. So absolutely, he had the authority to detain Abbott. Certainly reason to keep him there. He also, Drury also had the authority to advise Roy Moore later to keep the Abbott twin at the scene until Beardsley could make that decision. So to refresh everybody's memory, one of the Abbott twins returned to the crime scene after reporting it to the sheriff's office. That should automatically be kind of a thing that raises some alarms. Anybody who's watched any crime shows ever. The twin came up to Roy Moore, who's the Benton officer. He was out of his jurisdiction. and said, I'm the guy that reported the murder. And Moore's like, whoa, who said anything about a murder? Like, to his knowledge, that hadn't been reported yet. No one, knew that information. So he calls West Jury and says, I got a guy here who says he reported this. Is this true? West says, yeah, I know him. Send him on his way. Someone will get a hold of him later. So jury, because Beardsley hadn't arrived yet. Now Rick was at the car with the EMTs at this time, right? So this is this is all happening kind of at the same time, but Rick's at the car with the EMTs. They're trying to confirm that Mischelle is dead. And he's Rick Walters over there at the car trying to make sure that they don't disrupt the scene. Roy Moore's over here talking to this guy who said he's reported the call. So he wants to confirm that. So he calls Wes. Wes is a deputy in the jurisdiction. Roy Moore is not. He's a Benton officer. They're outside the city limits. He doesn't have that authority. So Wes Jury, who has the jurisdiction, and is a deputy, tells Roy Moore to let Abbott go. And so that's what he does. I would argue that that decision should have been left with Tom Beardsley. Beardsley was en route. Like he had to have missed that by 2 minutes or less, like a very short time frame there. And I think what should have happened is Wes said, well, keep him there till Beardsley gets there, and we'll let Beardsley make that call. But Jury made the call. I don't know how trained he was at the time. Probably not much. This is early in his career. He was a jailer basically, but still he made an important decision. And I think it was the wrong decision.
And then he made it again.
Yeah.
What are you going to do?
Yeah.
So the next question, Beardsley noted in the 1990s, Bill Farrell had deputies and reserve deputies in their own cars and junk cars bought by the county. He then pocketed the rest that was given to the department to purchase reliable newer vehicles. How legal was this? Someone in the discussion group keeps hammering on about the vehicle Rick Walter was driving, stating that's the reason the evidence was messed up. Can this be better explained on depositions? Could reserves drive their personal vehicles?
Yeah. So yes, they could drive their own personal vehicles. That's legal. It's important to know kind of up front here that Rick Walter was not patrolling that night. He was at the sheriff's station doing some background check on someone who had applied to be a reserve officer. So he was not there, patrolling or anything. When the householders came into the office, they thought it was just a stalled car. So he's like, you know what, I'm done here. I'll go check on it. And Roy Moore was there at the same time. He's like, I'll go with you. So they took the personal car. But is it legal? Was it legal? This whole personal thing? Yes. I mean, Beardsley talked a lot about that in the interview. Deputies could own their own cars. There were vehicles that the sheriff's department owned that Bill preferred them use. So this whole system that was being used at the time, Bill Farrell was getting, this is all in audit reports, but Bill Farrell was getting in the neighborhood of $125,000 a year in mileage reimbursement. Was it legal? Yeah, it was legal to own the cars and claim reimbursement. What's not legal is to fabricate mileage or claim personal miles and public miles. So there are some accusations from sources that I've talked to that claim that was happening. So again, Walter was driving his personal car that night. And again, the reports are pretty clear what happened. Walter, when he got to the scene, he called the sheriff's office, reporting that a woman was covered in blood inside the car. Wes jury and Newman were dispatching for help. Abbott comes into the sheriff's department. Jury writes down the name as Matt and told the twin they would catch up with him later. Newman also wrote down the name Matt in his, on his notes. Abbott returned to the scene. EMTs arrived. Walter worked with the EMTs. We kind of talked about all of this before, but I'm just rehashing some of this stuff. Moore was outside the car securing the area. There was a car that came before the Abbott twin, a white car who spoke in a thick Spanish accent. Moore sent that person on his way. Moore did not get a license plate number or ask for an ID for either the two people who drove by and stopped. Let's see. So basically what happens here is Walter called the information in to the dispatch, who then called in the reinforcements and the guy in charge. And the guy in charge was Tom Beardsley. He was the number 2. He was the guy who was called on things like this. And it was Beardsley's responsibility, based on his interviews that he did with me, it was his responsibility to determine whether the sheriff needed to get involved. But it's established in the department at the time that Tom Beardsley's the guy. Walter calls the dispatch. Dispatch calls Beardsley. Beardsley comes. EMTs come. Walter's protecting the scene. That's what he's doing. Walter did what he was supposed to do there. Walter, and Beardsley, there's some comments that I've seen where, oh, this should have been Highway Patrol from the very beginning. I hate to break it to you, but the Highway Patrol was very involved in this on the night of the murder, so, Highway Patrol gets involved. But Walter didn't collect any evidence. Walter's not the guy that's telling witnesses and suspicious vehicles to go on their way. The Highway Patrol collected all the evidence, and then Brenda Shivitz assisted in collecting the evidence and marking evidence from the car. The biggest mistakes weren't like that Walter didn't secure the scene. That's not what screwed up this case. The biggest mistakes were that you didn't hold the identical twin. It's interesting. Roy Moore has admitted publicly that he made a mistake by not getting the license plates numbers of the two vehicles. He wished he would have done that. But Moore absolutely wanted to keep Abbott for questioning. He thought Abbott should be held there. Again, it's outside of his jurisdiction, and he didn't get his ID because West Jury said, oh, I know him. I know him. We'll get with him later. So from Moore's standpoint, why do I need an ID? He didn't know they were twins. He didn't have that information. So was a mistake not getting the ID, stuff like that. I think, yes, it was a mistake not getting the license plate number. I mean, all of those things would have helped. But Rick Walter's not involved with any of this stuff. And again, all of this stuff is in the investigative reports. This isn't, very, very little of what I've said so far in this Q&A portion is from interviews. It's from the reports. And so Rick Walter played a very minor role. He was the first one at the scene, he and Roy Moore. But he didn't do much on this investigation. So if there are people out there who are trying to bang on Rick Walter on the original investigation, they're either misinformed or they're trying to score some political points, because blaming Rick for the initial investigation is not supported by the facts. And unless somebody can come forward with more information than I have here and say Rick Walter screwed up this initial unless they can do that and provide me some documents that I don't have that are on the record, you know, they're not coming from a neutral position. They're absolutely coming with an agenda. So if you're seeing those, if you're hearing those things out in the community, well, Rick Walter was first on the scene, he screwed this thing up. If you're hearing those things, that person is not coming from a position of fact. That's a political opinion. So there if you want to criticize Rick Walter for the subsequent investigation that he did in 2008, 2009, you know, when he was sheriff, when he reopened the case, I think that, you know, is fair game. I think Rick Walter would acknowledge that. I bet you Rick Walter would even say if he could do it again, he might do some things different. But if you're trying to blame that initial investigation on Rick Walter, you're not coming from a good place of factual information. Nitpicking those issues and trying to go after Rick Walter seems like it's a disservice to the case, and it's deflecting of all of the major obvious problems that are going on. All right, I've said enough on that. I'll get off my soapbox.
Okay. So the next question, quote, how if the deputy reserves had their own vehicles with the permission and orders of their boss, Bill Farrell, get the call about Mischelle, and how did they call out for assistance?
Well, they would be called by dispatch. I don't know exactly what the questioner is asking, like specifically, but you know, that's how they were called. They would be called by you know, Wes and Newman. That's how they'd be called to the scene.
So next question. When the first departments arrived, what was their first priority?
Yeah, basically the EMTs wanted to confirm that Mischelle was dead. And that didn't take long. And like I said earlier, once that was determined, Kinley asked the EMTs to remove their equipment, you know, and their job was pretty much done at that point.
So this is a big one. Is there enough evidence to convict?
Yeah, like that's a loaded question, right? Because who can convict? That's a jury, you know, a jury of your peers. I'm one person who's dug into this case. I know a lot. But I don't know the jurors that are going to be selected. I don't, you know, I believe there's probable cause for murder charges. I will say that, of at least one individual. And Rick Walter has already filed probable cause against 2 individuals, but the prosecutor, you know, disagreed, and he took it to a grand jury, and that did not yield an indictment.
Maybe note which prosecutor that was.
That was
not Amanda Ash.
Yeah, that was Paul Boyd. That was before Amanda Ash won the election. So the previous Boyd basically didn't agree with my assessment and didn't agree with Rick Walter's assessment, took it to a grand jury, and grand jury was just really weird. And so no indictments came forward from that. So I will say, and this is something that hasn't been talked about, and I just kind of want to bring it up. It's just something I've been thinking about. I think there's probable cause for charges of perjury against at least one individual, that being Mark Abbott. Perjury in a murder case that sends someone to prison for murder is a Class A felony. And that's the same class as murder itself. So, you know, you could get, you know, life in prison for something like that. There's no statute of limitations on Class A felonies in Missouri. And I believe that when you really look at it, there might be a stronger case for perjury than there is murder, because in a perjury case, you don't have to deal with, well, this guy's also a suspect and this guy's also a suspect. And this, there are 5 other suspects here that could have had motive. Well, only one person, you're only looking at one person as far as lying and sending someone to prison for a crime they didn't do. So, I don't know. I just wanted to kind of throw that out there as a possibility, but, the depending on what you believe is credible, after implicating Josh, Mark Abbott told Ron Burton, remember what he said? Yeah, I took care of that bitch. Like, if he's saying these things to other people, he's telling a story that is different than what he told under oath. But his story changed under oath too. So you've got these multiple things. He practically admitted in 2008, when Josh was going through his habeas trial, there was a direct question asked to Mark Abbott, and it was, would it be a lie to say today that you're 100% sure that Josh was the person? He's like, yeah, that would be a lie. If I said that today. So he's saying these things under oath, and he went on this long spiel about how, maybe he was influenced by Farrell and Shivitz in the lineup process, but still, like, perjury needs to have consequences, I think, especially in a case like this. I think this is just something to think about. And I think one of the benefits of that is if you went down that route and you lost, well, the murder charge is still out there. A lot of people are telling me, well, if you do a murder case and you lose, double jeopardy, you can't go back and do it again. Maybe this provides, an opportunity to get at the truth a little bit better, without that fear. I don't know. I just want to throw that out there. Is there enough to convict? It's impossible for me to say that. Is there probable cause for charges? I think there is, but those are two very, very different things.
So shifting gears a little bit, do you think that Al Lowe's and Bill Farrell were working together and Al Lowe's just didn't do the most with Josh's trial, end quote?
I do not think that. I don't think that at all. My take on Lowe's is that, well, first of all, I think David Rosner did most of the work. And Rosner knew the case much better than Al Lowe's did. But even under Lowe's, he provided reasonable doubt in that trial. You read that trial transcript. The thing about reading a transcript is you're taking personalities out of it. I mean, you're maybe imagining in your head someone if you know something, but when you just read the words, there's plenty of reasonable doubt there. But at the same time, Lowe's made plenty of mistakes. He missed on some chances and some opportunities, but I think, I think hindsight in 2020, that's, I used to run, be a runner, and I used to run 5Ks, or 10Ks. I even ran a half marathon, and you'd run it, you go in, you're prepared, you've trained, all this stuff. And then you get done with the race and you're like, man, I've wasted probably 5 seconds by not doing X, Y, or Z, or, like not preserving my energy up that hill, or, you go through these things. Could I have done it better? Yes. I think that probably lawyers have that same attitude, especially, in a loss. But Lowe's definitely made some poor decisions and missed some opportunities. There's no question about that. But I don't think that that means that he's like in some conspiracy. What's unfair is that the state made mistakes that harm Josh too. Like, you look the whole examination of what we're doing in this podcast is examining this case and all the things that were happened in the case. So the state makes mistakes that harms Josh, and then his own attorney makes mistakes that harms Josh. So like, he's the, of course it all harms the Lawless family too. But do I think that Lowe's was involved in some? No. I think the biggest evidence that there is that he was not involved in some sort of conspiracy is that when Kathy Fowler called him, he typed up a letter and put it on the record and sent it to the sheriff. Saying, hey, I talked to this Kathy Fowler. She's saying that Kevin Williams and Mark Abbott were involved somehow, and explained that whole thing, sent that letter, signed it, all of that. If you're in cahoots, you're not doing that. You may ignore it. You may make a phone call and then let it go, but he put it down in writing on a letter. I think the biggest thing though for the jury, again, when you read the transcript without the personalities, it's one thing, but Kenny Hulshoff was such a smooth operator, a charmer, smooth. And then you have the opposite of that in Al Lowe's, who is a barker and a curmudgeon, or I just think that he lost that battle entirely. So did Al Lowe's make mistakes? Yes. Was he a curmudgeon and not connecting with the jury? That's also true. But no, I do not think that he was somehow working with Bill Ferrell. I don't see that at all.
Okay. So question, can you expand on if Matt Abbott has had a deposition and if there is any evidence supporting his alibi the night of the murder?
Yeah. He was deposed by Al Lowe's and David Rosner. But you have to remember the deposition came in like the summer of 93. So the murder happened in the fall of 92. And so all of these months go by before he's even questioned. Now, unless I missed something, to my knowledge, there's no interview report of Matt Abbott by the original investigation, by Shivitz or Wyndham or any of those folks. Mark Abbott was questioned 3-4 times, but to my knowledge, Matt was not. And to my knowledge, there's no evidence supporting his alibi. So when he was deposed, he said, yeah, I was probably at my girlfriend's that night. I really don't remember. I got a hold of that ex-girlfriend and she couldn't remember either. She was like, we were going through a breakup at that time. And, she was pretty spooked that I reached out to her and wasn't real comfortable, but she she was like, I can't remember specific dates, whether he was there or not, so there's no like strong support that he was with her that night. And one of the interesting things that is just kind of hard to imagine is that he said that he didn't know about the murder for like 3 or 4 days. It's like, I was surprised that I didn't even know about it. So, it's all very nebulous when it comes to Matt Abbott and what he was doing, when he found out. I don't know, man. It just seems like if I was if that happened to me, and I found a dead body, and there was a murder that's all over the news. And if I'm close to my brother, he's going to be one of the first people I tell about it. That's just me. Here you got twin brothers. They're close enough to swap places. They talked about that. You're telling me he didn't know for 3 or 4 days? I don't know, man. I guess it's possible, but that's what he said. That's what he said. So
the next question, I guess for me, we know the evidence. Now, what is the next step? They are too close to the end to stop now. Like, who and what can we do, or who can we contact?
Well, the good news on this question is we've already made some progress on this point, right? About a month ago or so, Amanda Ash, the current prosecutor, in responding to some inquiries that I had, said that she has reached out to the Attorney General's office. They have a cold case unit, and then there's also the DDCC unit of the Highway Patrol. I can never remember what DDCC, but it's drug and crime control.
Drug and crime control.
Yeah. So they're involved in it too. So why did that happen? I believe that happened because of listeners and the public support of this podcast that's happening. People are talking about it. They want answers. I want answers. We all want answers. Like, we all want to see accountability on this. But what's not acceptable is to do nothing, and so in order for this to remain a priority within public spaces, and I'm talking the Attorney General now, and I'm talking Highway Patrol, and I'm talking Scott County Prosecutor, because I don't think the Scott County Sheriff's Department is doing anything anymore. In order to keep this case going and moving, there just needs to be this continued public pressure that's happening. And so we're kind of the tip of that arrow, the podcast is. But the more people listen, the more people know about it going far and wide, I think the higher the urgency is for the authorities to do their very best on this case. I don't think for a long time that we've been doing our very best, so what's what do you need to do? Just keep doing what you're doing. Talk about it. Keeping the more numbers that we have, the more not just prosecutors and AG, but your politicians, your elected politicians. I know for a fact that we've got multiple state legislators listening to this podcast, and they're very interested and they're very intrigued. And so that's happening. So I think we're just building this momentum. And I think when you get the cold case unit on it, I think they're going to look at it as a different set of eyes, a different perspective. And I think that they'll be able to get some things done. At least I hope so. So, contact your politicians and ask them, ask them or tell them that you're watching this case and that, you want to see justice done. So just the public pressure as much as possible will help move the needle.
And this next one, this is probably my favorite question of the whole list, because it kind of gets into the more nuts and bolts reporting side. But how do we know what you're sharing in the podcast is accurate versus made up?
Yeah, so that's a fair question. First of all, we're going to go through a lot of points on this, but first of all, most of the podcast, a great majority of the podcast contains statements from all of this you see back here. You know, these are transcripts. They're on the public record. I have spent hours and hours in the courthouse reviewing cases and looking for connections, and like, it's coming straight from reports. How could I make some of this stuff up? I mean, I couldn't make this stuff up, but it's most of it is coming from the record. And that's not only in these instances when people are under oath, this is what they're stating as truth. But not only that, this is protection for me. It's in the public record, I'm not going to be going out and making stuff up and exposing myself, to a legitimate kind of defamation suit. So that's kind of the first point. We, of course, know that some of the stuff that's been stated under oath is not true because we have differing stories, right? So some of what we're trying to do is to highlight those inconsistencies. I talked about the perjury charges earlier, but things that are said on the public record as they go across time, if those stories change, we know that some of that's not true because the story is changing, but that's part of the point, right? We're showing this, we're demonstrating that this person's story is changing. What they claimed here is different than over here, and now it's changing again. So in those instances, we are publishing things that we know not to be true, but comparing them to things that have already been said. So some of this is left up to interpretation. Now, there are some parts that we've talked about that are, this is a very small part of the podcast, that are not in the public record, but are revealed in interviews that are interviews that might be with a source that's anonymous. And those are all taken on a case-by-case basis. So, there's a number of different things that we look at. Are these statements that are being made, are they supported by other statements? Are there ways to confirm that these statements are true with other public documents? So one example of that would be, I heard from my former boss that Norm Lambert might not have committed suicide. I thought, whoa, where did that come from? I eventually got my hands on the records, the investigative records, the autopsy, the photos. I reviewed all of it, and it supports that claim. So we look at, does this person have an obvious incentive to lie? In court, sometimes when you have these situations, this kind of came up in the David Robinson case out of Sykeston, where two different statements were made. A witness has come forward and saying, I lied previously. So then the court looks at giving more credibility to someone who's making a statement against their own self-interest. We kind of apply that same standard too. Like, if someone's telling us something that's putting them in danger, putting them at risk, we're more likely to believe that than if there looks like there's some sort of benefit that they may be getting from it. Frankly, we believe our sources are way more credible than the jailhouse snitches that the state used against Josh. They were telling a story that benefits them to get deals for less prison sentence, years of time. That's a huge incentive. What incentive are we giving? We're not paying. We talked about Andy Stone in the podcast, how he wanted payment. Nope. And this is why. We're not going to give information for something when they've got a benefit on the other end of the line. And then, we also look at, does the statement or information that's provided by this source fit an established pattern of behavior supplied by other sourcing? So, that's kind of where you see multiple examples of certain behavior coming out in the podcast. So all of those things kind of play into it. Give another example of David Rosner. David Rosner, when he's telling me about this check incident, like, he knows what's at stake. He's an attorney. He knows the standards of defamation, but he's sharing this information anyway. He saw it with his own eyes. It fits some other patterns of behavior that I've seen, some other interviews and things that I've done, some of which we haven't aired. And I think sometimes what happens is that listeners are listening to all this podcast and think that we're putting out everything we know. There is so much that we know that we haven't published. And a lot of it's very shocking stuff. We're not putting out everything we know. Some of it hasn't been confirmed. Some of it we're just not ready to do yet. We want to try to get even more confirmation. So, all of this goes on throughout the course of this. But the basis, the bedrock of this entire podcast is what's on the record: documents, court transcripts, investigative reports, old media reports. While it's not like, a court document, a sheriff being interviewed about a murder case in the newspaper way back then is relevant to what they're saying now, or how their stories change over the years. So that's, we use all of that. And then when we have information from a source who's afraid of repercussions, usually physical, we work with that, and then we weigh it against everything else that we have. So, what was made up? The initial trial against Josh Keezer, that was made up, because they didn't even bother to interview Josh's alibis. We've made offers to some of these people that we're talking about in the podcast to come on and interview with us. We've not heard back from them. So they used sources that did have incentives to lie, all of them. And they didn't treat certain people with the suspicion that they should have. So make your own judgment. Every listener has to make their own judgment of what's true, what's not true. But yes, that's a peek behind the curtain of what we're dealing with here at the Lawless Files, and the things that we weigh before we publish anything. So.
And just, I know that people in our immediate area are familiar with you as a former newspaper editor, and but for people who are maybe outside of Missouri and who may have missed it, where'd you learn how to do all of this stuff, make these types of decisions?
Yeah, I've been a journalist since I was 19 years old. Started a weekly newspaper. 45 now. And worked in various roles throughout the newspaper industry. Lots of training during that time. I was at one point over the copy desk. I was the managing editor and editor of Newsroom. I've been a reporter for many years. So I've been in that world. I was in that world for 24 years. And now I'm doing this. It's independent work, but a lot of those values come with me. In fact, being independent allows me some freedom that I wouldn't have necessarily working for another organization. I get to decide. I'm the one who decides basically what is published. So, but I carry all of that training, all of that with me, into this project. It's been,
It just, from the question, it seems like maybe the question asker is not sure what to make of you, or maybe you're just, some guy, or no, you know what you're doing.
yeah. Well, it was on there's another group, Facebook group, and it has to do with Sykeston, and someone said you got to listen to the Lawless Files podcast. And these are the types of questions that are being asked. And they're legitimate. It's a legitimate question. Like, it's a smart question to ask. How do I know this to be? Who is this? Who's doing this information? How do I know it's to be true? And that's why we're doing things like the reenactments of the court documents. You're hearing word for word what was said. I'm not paraphrasing that. I paraphrase occasionally, but we're bringing you interviews with Rick Walter and exactly what he's saying. Interviews with Josh. This is exactly what he's saying. Kevin Williams, Mark Abbott, their words, what they're saying. Bill Farrell's own words, when he was asked these questions, this is how he answered them. These are all backed by these documents. This is not me making this up. So that we're trying to be very transparent in that way on the podcast. Now you can't air every single word of every single interview that you do. But what you're hearing is people's own words for a lot of this podcast. Now things like the audits that we talked about a little bit, that's 6 years worth of audits that I've condensed down into a 5-minute or 7-minute intro of kind of the things that were happening with the reimbursements and so forth. But if anybody wants to question me about it, well, let's go to the documents. Let's go to the news reports from the time. This isn't me making up stuff. Now, did I have a source that was in that intro that was telling me things anonymously? Yes, but it's all supported. It's all based on what's in the documents. So anyway, I feel like we've been aggressive to the point of still being responsible. We have to weigh a lot of things. We have to weigh the risk of lawsuits, and this is any media organization, against what the public needs to know, and it's an incredible story. it's entertaining, but it's also, this is stuff that I think the public has to know if they want justice, if they want to change the culture, if they want things to get better. So anyway, I haven't spent 4 years of work. I haven't put my safety, my family's safety at risk on a fake story. I wouldn't do that. That makes no sense. So if you don't believe it, that's your choice. But from my perspective, why would I do that? You know?
And if all this stuff sounds outrageous to you, you're not alone, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. It's been, there's been so many, like, you know, I've been living with it for a long time. And so you kind of grow immune to it. But what the public is seeing some of this stuff or hearing about this stuff for the first time, and they're having the same reactions that I had when I was first learning about these things. So it's not surprising, you know, that people are shocked. I was shocked. And I kept digging. So
well, I think that was our that was the last question we had on our list here. Is there anything else that you wanted to cover?
No. We're working on episode 13. Hope to have it out soon. I'm actually waiting for some documents. I need some documents to get here before I move forward with that. But we're working on it. We're trying to still put out valuable content for all of our appreciated paid supporters. Right now I am trying to do this as a full time. And we rely on the subscribers that we get. So thank you so much, everyone, for contributing. It helps me keep going and keep doing this digging. So appreciate everyone. We're continuing to get more and more information, deeper information. And we hope that it results in some things down the line. So keep listening. Appreciate everyone's support. And I guess that's it for now. So thanks everyone for joining us. You've been listening to the Lawless Files. Thanks, Tyler.
Thank you.